The child's weight was nothing in Margaret's arms, lighter than the laundry she carried up 3 flights of stairs each morning. Yet as she climbed those same stairs now, each step felt like ascending a mountain. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight, its deep bronze voice echoing through corridors that hadn't heard a child's laughter in decades. Margaret's quarters occupied a corner of the estate's 2nd floor, modest rooms that had housed head housekeepers for generations. She'd chosen them 40 years ago for their practicality, close enough to the main areas to respond quickly to any crisis, far enough from the family wing to maintain proper boundaries. Tonight, that distance felt like a blessing. She laid the girl on her own bed, the child's dark hair fanning across Margaret's plain white pillowcase like spilled ink. In the lamplight, the resemblance to the portrait in the main hall was even more striking. Evangeline Ravenshallow had been painted at age 8, shortly before the fire that claimed her life. The artist had captured something unsettling in that long-ago child's eyes, the same ancient quality that now stared up at Margaret from her own bed. "What am I doing?" Margaret whispered to herself, a habit formed from decades of solitary service. She'd never brought anyone to her private rooms, had never broken protocol so thoroughly. Mrs. Pemberton, the previous head housekeeper, would have been scandalized. But Mrs. Pemberton had never found a child who felt warm, despite being unconscious in a storm, whose breathing was so shallow it barely fogged the mirror Margaret held to her lips. Margaret fetched clean linens and warm water, her movements automatic despite her racing thoughts. The girl's clothes were strange, a white nightgown that looked handmade, with delicate embroidery that seemed oddly familiar. As Margaret carefully changed her into one of her own flannel nightgowns, she noticed more peculiarities. The child's skin was unblemished, almost luminous, and her fingernails were longer than seemed natural for someone so young. "There now," Margaret murmured, tucking the blankets around the small form. "You're safe." The lie came easier than it should have. Nothing about this situation felt safe, not the way the shadows in the room seemed deeper than usual, or how the storm outside had intensified the moment Margaret brought the child inside. The wind howled through the estate's countless gaps and cracks, creating a symphony of whispers that raised the hair on Margaret's neck. She settled into her armchair beside the bed, determined to keep watch. Sleep had become elusive in recent months anyway, another burden of age joining her creaking joints and failing eyesight. The estate felt different lately, restless in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of her early days here, when grief still hung over Ravenshallow like morning fog. Lord Ravenshallow had been a broken man when she'd first arrived in 1947, still mourning the wife and daughter he'd lost to the fire. He'd died 10 years later, leaving the estate to a distant cousin who visited twice a year and otherwise ignored the property's slow decay. Margaret had remained because someone needed to tend the old place, to keep its secrets and maintain its dignity. Now she wondered if she'd stayed for another reason entirely. The child stirred, murmuring words in what sounded like Latin. Margaret leaned closer, straining to understand, but the words faded into silence. The girl's breathing had deepened, becoming more natural, though her skin maintained that peculiar warmth. Margaret found herself studying the child's face in the lamplight, noting details that made her chest tighten with inexplicable emotion. The delicate bone structure, the way her dark lashes curved against her cheek, even the small beauty mark near her left temple, all of it matched Evangeline's portrait with unnerving precision. Impossible, Margaret breathed. Yet she'd seen enough impossibilities in her decades at Ravenshallow to know that dismissing them outright was foolish. The estate had its own logic, its own rules that didn't always align with the outside world. The storm began to subside as dawn approached, the rain gentling to a steady patter against the windows. Margaret dozed fitfully in her chair, waking each time the child moved or made a sound. By the time grey morning light filtered through her curtains, exhaustion weighed on her like a physical presence. The girl's eyes opened as the first true ray of sunlight touched the windowsill. They were violet, not the blue of most children, not even the deep blue-violet that could be mistaken for purple in certain light. They were the color of twilight itself, of shadows given form. and when they focused on Margaret with startling clarity, there was recognition in their depths. "You came," the child whispered, her voice carrying a faint accent that belonged to no particular region Margaret could identify. "I knew you would. I've been waiting such a long time." Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The girl spoke as if they'd met before, as if this moment had been predetermined. But more unsettling still was the way those ancient eyes looked at her, not with the confusion of a lost child, but with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans had finally come to fruition. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the urge to flee her own room. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept Ravenshollow running smoothly for 40 years, insisted there must be a reasonable explanation. Children sometimes spoke strangely when they were ill or traumatized, but those violet eyes held no confusion, no disorientation. They watched her with the patience of someone far older than 8. "I think you're mistaken, dear," Margaret managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "We've never met before. I found you outside in the storm." The child tilted her head, a gesture so reminiscent of the Ravenshollow portrait that Margaret's breath caught. "Haven't we? You've walked these halls for so long, Margaret. I've seen you in the mirrors, in the shadows between the wallpaper. Always so careful, always so proper." No one had told the girl her name. Margaret rose abruptly, busying herself with straightening already straight curtains. "You need rest. And food. When did you last eat?" She was deflecting, falling back into the rhythm that had governed her life since 1947. Identify the problem. Address it efficiently, maintain order. Order was what she understood. Order was what she'd built her existence around at Ravenshollow. Every morning at 5:30, she rose and dressed in her grey uniform. By 6, she was in the kitchen preparing her simple breakfast and reviewing the day's tasks. The estate might be crumbling and nearly empty, but standards were standards. She dusted the same rooms her predecessor had dusted, polished the same silverware that hadn't been used for proper entertaining in decades. Twice a year, she prepared the East Wing for Lord Pemberton's brief visits, ensuring his sheets were crisp and his meals served punctually. The rest of the time, she maintained the estate like a museum, preserving something precious that no one else seemed to value. It was a solitary life, but it was hers. She had her wireless for the BBC programs, her library books from the village, her correspondence with her sister in Cornwall, who still invited her for Christmas visits she never accepted. Margaret had long ago convinced herself that this was enough. "I'm not hungry for food," the child said quietly. The words sent another chill through Margaret. She turned back to find the girl sitting up in bed, the morning light seeming to pass through her rather than illuminate her. "Everyone needs food, especially growing children. I'll fix you some porridge and tea." "The sunlight hurts." Margaret glanced at the window. The storm had indeed passed, leaving behind the kind of crisp autumn morning that usually lifted her spirits. She'd planned to spend the day clearing fallen branches from the garden paths, perhaps finally tackling the rose beds that had grown wild without proper care. Small, manageable tasks that gave shape to her days. Now she found herself drawing the curtains closed again, plunging the room back into gentle gloom. "Better?" she asked, disturbed by how natural the gesture felt. The child, she needed a name, Margaret realized, smiled for the first time. It should have been reassuring. Instead, Margaret glimpsed something that made her take an involuntary step backward. The girl's canine teeth were longer than they should be. Too sharp, too white, much better. You understand, don't you? You've always understood what others couldn't see. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, desperate to ground this conversation in something normal. "Don't you know?" The child's head tilted again. "You've said it so many times, standing before my portrait in the hall. I've heard you during your evening rounds. 'Poor little Evangeline,' you always whisper. What a waste." Margaret's denial died on her lips. She did pause before that portrait during her nightly security walks, had done so for decades. Something about the painted girl's expression had always seemed lonely to her, trapped forever at age 8 in her golden frame. But she'd never spoken aloud to it. Had she? That's impossible, Margaret said, though the word felt hollow. Evangeline Ravenshallow died 100 years ago. Did she? The child, Evangeline, swung her legs over the side of the bed with fluid grace. Or did she simply sleep, waiting for someone who would understand? Someone who knew what it meant to be alone in this place, keeping its secrets, tending its ghosts. The words hit closer to home than Margaret cared to admit. She had tended this estate's ghosts in a way, preserved the memory of a family that had died out, maintained rooms that would never again serve their intended purpose. Her entire adult life had been spent in service to the past, to people who existed now only in portraits and dusty photographs. What did she have to show for it? What would remain when she herself was gone? "You're in shock," Margaret said firmly, as much to herself as to the child. "You need medical attention. I'll ring Dr. Henley in the village." But even as she said it, Margaret knew she wouldn't make that call. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening in her carefully ordered world, and why a part of her, a part she'd spent 40 years suppressing, felt more alive than it had in decades. Evangeline's laugh was like silver bells, but with an undertone that made Margaret think of graves and old secrets. Dr. Henley? The same man who pronounced me dead a century ago? How amusing that would be. Margaret's hand froze halfway to the telephone. The certainty in the child's voice was absolute, not the confused rambling of trauma, but the clear recollection of lived experience. That's... Dr. Henley is quite young. His grandfather, perhaps. His great-great-grandfather, actually. Jeremiah Henley. He had the same weak chin as the current doctor, and hands that shook when he wrote my death certificate. Evangeline stood, moving with that unsettling grace, and walked to Margaret's mirror. Her reflection wavered, as if the glass couldn't quite capture her image properly. He smelled of gin and fear when he examined my body after the fire. Most people feared to touch me, even dead. The rational world Margaret had inhabited for 67 years began cracking like ice over a winter pond. She found herself studying the child's reflection, or lack thereof. The mirror showed the room clearly, showed Margaret herself standing pale and shocked by the telephone, but Evangeline appeared only as a shimmer, a suggestion of form that the eye couldn't quite hold. "This isn't real," Margaret whispered. "You're not real." Real is such a limited concept, don't you think? Evangeline turned from the mirror, and now Margaret could see something that hadn't been visible in the lamplight, a thin scar along the child's throat, nearly hidden by the collar of the borrowed nightgown. I was real enough when the fire took our estate, real enough when it burned away everything except what I truly was underneath. The telephone rang. The sound shattered the strange intimacy of the moment, its shrill tone cutting through the drawn curtains and impossible conversations like a blade. Margaret stared at it, her training warring with her growing certainty that answering would change everything irrevocably. "Answer it," Evangeline said softly. "But remember, Margaret, once you invite the outside world into this moment, there's no taking it back. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Margaret's hand trembled as she lifted the receiver. "Ravenshallow Estate. Miss Thornfield? This is Constable Wickham from the village. We've had reports of a missing child, girl, about 8 years old, dark hair. Her family's beside themselves with worry. Last seen near your area during the storm." The lie came so easily it frightened her. "I'm afraid I haven't seen anyone, Constable. The storm was quite fierce. I spent the entire evening indoors." "Well, if you do see anything, the family's offering a reward." Poor little thing, out in weather like that. A pause. Strange thing, though. The family couldn't quite agree on when they'd last seen her. Some said yesterday, others swore it was last week. Shock, I suppose. Margaret watched Evangeline, who had moved to the window and was peering through a gap in the curtains. Even that small amount of filtered sunlight seemed to cause her discomfort, her pale skin growing even more translucent. "I'll certainly keep watch, Constable." "Much appreciated." "Oh, and Miss Thornfield. The family mentioned something odd. Said the girl's been talking about the old estate, about someone named Margaret who was waiting for her. Probably nothing, but..." Another pause. Children do say the strangest things when they're troubled. The line went dead. Margaret set the receiver down with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter what remained of her sanity. She had just lied to the police. In her 40 years at Ravenshallow, she had never so much as bent a rule, let alone broken the law. "They won't remember correctly," Evangeline said without turning from the window. "Time becomes fluid around people like me. Memories shift to accommodate impossibilities. It's a kindness, really. Humans weren't meant to hold too much truth at once." "What are you?" Margaret heard herself ask. "I think you know." Evangeline faced her again, and in the dim light, her violet eyes seemed to glow with their own inner fire. "The question isn't what I am, Margaret. The question is what you're going to do about it." The choice crystallized before her with startling clarity. She could open the curtains, expose whatever Evangeline truly was to the harsh light of day, literally and figuratively. Call Constable Wickham back, admit her lie, return this impossible child to whatever family was searching for her. Or she could draw the curtains tighter, disconnect the telephone, and step fully into a world where portraits came to life and mirrors couldn't hold certain reflections. Margaret looked around her orderly room, at the life she'd built from duty and routine and careful emotional distance. For 40 years she had served others' memories, tended others' legacies, preserved others' stories. What would it be like, she wondered, to finally have a story of her own? The weight of that question hung in the air between them, like incense, heavy and transformative. Margaret's fingers worried the fabric of her apron, a nervous habit she'd developed during her first anxious months at Ravenshallow. Back then, she'd been 27, and desperate for stability after her mother's death left her with nothing but a worn reference letter and the clothes on her back. Now, 40 years later, that same uncertainty crawled up her spine with familiar claws. "I should call the constable back," she said, but made no move toward the telephone. "Tell him the truth." "Should you?" Evangeline settled onto the window seat, her small form barely casting a shadow even in the dim light. "And what truth would that be, Margaret? That you found a child who claims to be someone who died before you were born? That she has no reflection and speaks of things no 8-year-old should know?" Margaret's breath caught. She'd been so focused on the impossibility of Evangeline's existence that she hadn't considered how it would sound to others. They'd think her mad. At best, they'd assume the isolation had finally cracked her mind. At worst, the thought of being removed from Ravenshallow, of being placed in some sterile facility where kind-voiced nurses spoke to her like she was already gone, made her stomach clench with terror. This estate was all she had. Without it, she was nothing, just another elderly woman whose usefulness had expired. "But keeping you here," Margaret's voice faltered. "What if you're dangerous?" The question hung between them like a blade. Evangeline's violet eyes reflected no hurt at the accusation, only a terrible understanding that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I am dangerous," she said simply. "Not in the way you might think, but yes. My very existence threatens the order you've built your life around. I'm the crack in the foundation, Margaret. The loose thread that once pulled unravels everything." Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 67 years. Her joints ached with the morning dampness, her eyes burned from the sleepless night, and her carefully ordered world tilted on an axis she couldn't see or understand. "I don't know how to—" She gestured helplessly at the space between them. I'm a housekeeper. I dust furniture and polish silver and ensure the linens are properly aired. I don't know how to care for someone like you." "Someone like me," Evangeline repeated softly. "Do you mean a child, Margaret? Or do you mean a monster?" The word hit like a physical blow. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the denial wouldn't come, because wasn't that exactly what she feared? That behind those ancient eyes and impossible knowledge lurked something that would demand more than she was capable of giving. Her sister Grace had always said Margaret was afraid of need, her own and others. "You hide behind duty," Grace had written in her last letter, "because duty asks for service, not love. Service has rules, boundaries. Love is messier, Margaret had burned that letter, but she'd never forgotten the words. Now she looked at this strange child who spoke of waiting and mirrors and memories that shouldn't exist, and felt the familiar urge to retreat behind the safety of protocol. There had to be proper procedures for this situation, surely. Some authority she could defer to, some manual that would tell her the correct course of action. But even as her mind searched for escape routes, her heart registered a truth she didn't want to acknowledge. For the first time in 40 years, Ravenshallow didn't feel empty. The echoing halls and dust-covered rooms had always seemed to mock her solitary footsteps. But now the estate felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would choose. "The family that's looking for you," Margaret said carefully. "Are they really your family?" Evangeline's smile was sad and knowing. "They're good people who found an empty cradle and filled it with love and hope. They gave me a name that wasn't mine and a history I couldn't claim. I didn't mean to hurt them by leaving, but staying was becoming difficult." "Difficult how?" "I don't age as they expected. I don't eat as I should. And lately I've been walking in my sleep, trying to find my way back here." She touched the window glass with one pale finger, leaving no mark. They were beginning to ask questions I couldn't answer without destroying their peace. Margaret thought of the constable's words about the family's confused memories, their disagreement about when they'd last seen Evangeline. The kindness of forgetting, the girl had called it, a mercy for those who couldn't bear the weight of impossible truth. But what about those who could? What about those who had spent so long in service to the past that the present had lost its grip on them? Margaret looked around her room again, at the neatly arranged furniture, the precisely folded linens, the photograph of her and Grace as children that was the only personal item she allowed herself to display. Everything in its place, everything serving its function. Everything except the growing certainty that her story wasn't over yet. Margaret stood and walked to her wardrobe, her hands moving with the automatic precision of 4 decades habit. She pulled out a fresh grey uniform, then stopped, the fabric heavy in her trembling fingers. How many mornings had she dressed in this same outfit, prepared for the same routines, walked the same paths through rooms that grew more ghostly with each passing year? "I've never had a choice," she said quietly, not looking at Evangeline. "Not a real one. When Mother died, I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because leaving felt impossible. I convinced myself it was duty, but really—" She smoothed the uniform with shaking hands. "Really, I was just afraid. And now—" Margaret hung the uniform back in the wardrobe and closed the door with deliberate finality. The sound echoed like a judgment in the still air. "Now I'm still afraid." She turned to face Evangeline, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm more afraid of going back to sleepwalking through my days, pretending that preservation is the same as living." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. For 40 years, Margaret had hidden behind the comfortable fiction that she was indispensable to Ravenshallow, that without her careful stewardship the estate would crumble into ruin. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. She had used the estate's needs as an excuse to avoid examining her own. What did she want? When had she last asked herself that question? Margaret walked to her desk and opened the bottom drawer, withdrawing a small leather journal she hadn't touched in years. Her mother's journal, filled with pressed flowers and observations about the changing seasons, dreams of travel and romance, and all the experiences a woman's life might hold. Margaret had stopped reading it after coming to Ravenshallow, finding its hopes too painful to bear. She wanted to see Venice, Margaret said, running her fingers over the worn cover. The floating city, she called it. She saved for years, planning a trip she never took because I needed schooling, then clothes for work, then... She shrugged. There was always something more practical. What did you want to see? The question caught Margaret off guard. No one had ever asked her that, not in all her adult life. She'd been a daughter, then a servant, but never simply herself with desires worth considering. "Everything," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep and long buried. "I wanted to see everything. Egyptian pyramids and Scottish highlands and the aurora borealis. I wanted to taste wine in French vineyards and hear opera in Italian theaters and—" her voice broke. I wanted to matter to someone, not as a caretaker or guardian or keeper of other people's memories, but as myself. The silence that followed felt sacred, as if the room itself was absorbing her confession and transforming it into something precious. You matter to me, Evangeline said simply. Margaret laughed, a sound caught between joy and hysteria. You don't even know me. Don't I? Evangeline rose from the window seat, moving with that uncanny grace toward Margaret's bookshelf. She touched the spine of a volume of poetry, Keats, that Margaret hadn't read in years but couldn't bring herself to pack away. I know you read romantic poets when the loneliness becomes too sharp. I know you talk to my portrait because you understand what it means to be frozen in place, watching time pass from behind glass. I know you've spent 40 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Each word struck like a bell, resonating through Margaret's carefully constructed defenses. This strange child saw her, not the efficient housekeeper or the reliable employee, but the woman underneath who dreamed of floating cities and distant lights dancing across foreign skies. If I help you, Margaret said slowly, if I choose this path, there's no going back, is there? No. Evangeline's honesty was absolute. Once you cross this threshold with me, Margaret, you become part of something larger than duty or fear. You become part of a story that has been waiting a century to unfold. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tumblers falling into place in a lock she'd carried without realizing. She thought of her mother's journal, of all those unvisited places and untaken chances. She thought of Grace's letters, growing shorter and more distant each year as her sister gave up trying to reach across the wall Margaret had built around herself. She thought of standing before Evangeline's portrait night after night, whispering sympathy to a painted child who apparently heard every word. What happens now? Margaret asked. Evangeline's smile transformed her pale features, making her look both ancient and impossibly young. Now we begin. But first, you should probably disconnect the telephone. I suspect Constable Wickham will be calling again soon, and this time, the lies will need to be much more elaborate. Margaret unplugged the phone without hesitation, severing her last connection to the ordinary world. The silence that followed felt different from the countless quiet mornings Margaret had endured at Ravenshallow. This wasn't the hollow echo of emptiness, but the charged stillness before lightning strikes. She stared at the disconnected telephone cord in her hand, marveling at how such a simple action could feel so monumentally irreversible. What comes next? She asked, setting the cord down with exaggerated care. Evangeline moved to the window again, but this time she drew the heavy curtains completely closed, plunging the room into an intimate twilight. Now you learn what it means to harbor someone like me. The rules are different than what you're accustomed to. As if summoned by her words, a sharp knock echoed through the estate's main entrance. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. She recognized that authoritative rhythm, Constable Wickham's knock, demanding rather than requesting entry. He's persistent, Evangeline observed with unsettling calm, and he's brought someone with him. Margaret crept to her bedroom window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Below, she could see the constable's familiar blue uniform, but beside him stood a woman Margaret didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the desperate posture of someone clinging to hope by her fingernails. The family, Margaret breathed. My adoptive mother, Evangeline confirmed without looking. Sarah Chen. She's a professor of ancient history at Cambridge. Brilliant woman. She found me when I was between incarnations, and gave me 5 years of as normal a childhood as someone like me can have. The knocking grew more insistent. Margaret heard her name being called, the sound muffled by distance and thick doors but carrying an unmistakable note of urgency. They'll search the grounds if I don't answer, Margaret said. Constable Wickham has that authority. Yes. Evangeline finally turned from the window, and in the dim light, her pale skin seemed to glow with its own luminescence. Which means you need to decide right now how far you're willing to go to protect me. The question hung between them like a challenge. Margaret felt the weight of her entire careful existence pressing down on her shoulders. 40 years of respectability, of being known in the village as reliable Margaret Thornfield who never caused trouble or drew unwanted attention. All of that would crumble the moment she was caught harboring a missing child. But as she watched Evangeline's ancient eyes, Margaret realized something that should have terrified her, but instead felt like revelation. She no longer cared about respectability. The thought of returning to her old life, the endless echoing days of dusting empty rooms and polishing unused silver, felt like a kind of death. "The cellar," she said suddenly. "There's a hidden room behind the wine storage, built during the Civil War for hiding valuables. I've only been down there twice in 40 years. Relief flickered across Evangeline's features. "You'll need to be convincing. Professor Chen knows I sometimes know things about places I've never been. She'll be watching for signs." Margaret was already moving, gathering the borrowed nightgown and anything else that might betray another presence in her orderly room. "What about food? Do you eat?" "Not as you understand eating." Evangeline's smile was sad. "But I appreciate the concern. Take me to the cellar, Margaret, then answer your door and lie better than you've ever lied in your life." They moved through the estate's corridors like shadows, Margaret's practical shoes silent on runners she'd walked thousands of times, Evangeline floating beside her with that unnerving grace. The morning light filtering through tall windows seemed to bend around the child, creating pockets of shadow that defied the natural laws of illumination. The cellar stairs creaked familiar warnings under Margaret's weight, but Evangeline's feet made no sound at all. The hidden room was exactly as Margaret remembered, small, windowless, with stone walls that had once concealed royalist treasures from Cromwell's soldiers. Now it would hide a different kind of impossible thing. "How long?" Margaret asked as she lit an old oil lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. "Until dark. Sunlight and I have an uncomfortable relationship." Evangeline settled onto a dusty wooden crate as if it were a throne. "Margaret, thank you. I know what this choice costs you." Margaret wanted to say it cost her nothing, that her old life had been hollow anyway, that she was trading emptiness for purpose. But that would have been another lie, and she'd used her quota of those for one morning. "It costs me everything," she said honestly, "and somehow that feels exactly right." Knocking upstairs grew thunderous. Margaret took one last look at Evangeline, this impossible child who had tumbled out of a storm and a century of secrets, then climbed the stairs to face the first real test of her transformed existence. Behind her, the oil lamp's flame flickered, but held steady, casting protective shadows around mysteries she was only beginning to understand. Margaret paused at the top of the cellar stairs, her hand trembling against the doorframe as the thunderous knocking reverberated through Ravenshallow's ancient bones. The sound seemed to shake dust from the very foundations, each blow a countdown to the moment her carefully ordered world would either expand into something miraculous or collapse entirely. She pressed her palm against the wood, feeling the vibrations travel up her arm like an electric current. Somewhere below, Evangeline sat in shadows and lamplight, trusting Margaret with a secret that could destroy them both. The weight of that trust was heavier than 40 years of accumulated solitude, and infinitely more precious. The knocking stopped. In the sudden silence, Margaret heard voices, muffled by thick doors but carrying the unmistakable cadence of desperation. Professor Chen was speaking rapidly, her words punctuated by Constable Wickham's deeper tones. Margaret caught fragments. 2 days now, and not like her to. And the heartbreaking, "Please, if she's here." Margaret smoothed her grey uniform with shaking hands, then stopped. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, rumpled from a sleepless night. Any observant person would notice. She needed to appear normal, reliable. The Margaret Thornfield who had never harbored secrets more complicated than her mother's hidden poetry books. Moving with practiced efficiency despite her racing heart, she climbed the narrow back stairs to her quarters. In her wardrobe mirror, she caught sight of herself, wild-haired, wide-eyed, looking every inch like a woman who had stumbled into something beyond her comprehension. Which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. But as she pulled on fresh clothes and pinned her grey hair into its customary neat bun, Margaret felt a strange transformation occurring. Each familiar motion seemed to create a mask, a performance of normalcy that would protect what lay beneath. She was not simply Margaret the housekeeper anymore. She was Margaret the guardian of impossible things. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a fierce, unexpected joy. The knocking resumed as she descended the main staircase, her footsteps echoing in the grand foyer with its dust-covered chandelier and faded portraits of long-dead raven-swallows. The sound was different now. Sharper, more official. Constable Wickham had clearly run out of patience. "Coming," she called, injecting just the right note of irritated confusion into her voice, as if she'd been interrupted during important household duties rather than committing what was likely, several crimes against crown and common sense. Margaret unlocked the heavy front door and opened it wide, blinking in the autumn sunlight with what she hoped appeared to be genuine surprise. "Constable Wickham, whatever brings you back so early?" The constable's weathered face was grim, but it was the woman beside him who commanded Margaret's attention. Professor Chen was smaller than she'd appeared from the upstairs window, but her presence filled the doorway with barely contained anguish. Her dark hair was disheveled, her expensive coat wrinkled as if she'd slept in it. This was a woman who had spent 2 nights wondering if the child she loved was alive or dead. "Mrs. Thornfield," the constable said formally, "I'd like you to meet Professor Sarah Chen. This is about that missing child I mentioned yesterday, Evangeline. Professor Chen is her guardian." The name hung in the air between them like a test. Margaret felt the professor's intelligent eyes searching her face, looking for any flicker of recognition or guilt. This woman studied ancient mysteries for a living. She would be skilled at reading the signs others missed. "Of course," Margaret said gently, stepping aside. "Please, both of you, come in. I'll put the kettle on." Professor Chen moved into the foyer with careful steps, her gaze traveling over the faded grandeur with academic interest despite her obvious distress. "This place is remarkable," she said softly. "The architecture suggests late 16th century, with Georgian additions, and the atmosphere—" She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. "There's something almost familiar about it." Margaret's blood chilled, but she kept her voice steady. "The estate has quite a history, 400 years of it. Would you prefer tea or coffee, Professor?" "Tea, please." Professor Chen's attention had shifted to the portrait gallery, where generations of raven-swallows gazed down with painted eyes. This missing child, Evangeline, she has such unusual interests for an 8-year-old. Gothic architecture, genealogy, local folklore. She's particularly drawn to stories about— Her voice caught. About places like this. The constable cleared his throat. "We'd like your permission to search the grounds, Mrs. Thornfield. I know it's an imposition, but a child's safety—" "Of course," Margaret heard herself saying. "Whatever you need. Though I must warn you, the estate is quite extensive, and some of the outbuildings aren't entirely safe. Perhaps you could tell me more about this child while I prepare refreshments? I'd know better where to suggest looking." Professor Chen's gratitude was immediate and heartbreaking. "She's extraordinary," she began, her voice soft with love and worry. "Brilliant beyond her years, but sometimes she seems to remember things that never happened to her. Places she's never been, people she's never met." Margaret nodded sympathetically while her mind raced. Downstairs, Evangeline waited in shadows that had hidden secrets for 3 centuries. Outside, the autumn sun climbed higher, and with each passing moment, the lies Margaret would need to tell grew more elaborate and dangerous. "Tell me everything," she said. Professor Chen's hands shook as she accepted the delicate china teacup, and Margaret watched a single tear trace down the woman's cheek before being hastily wiped away. This was grief in its rawest form, the particular agony of a parent whose child had simply vanished into the world's indifferent vastness. "She came to me 3 years ago," Professor Chen began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Through the university's fostering program. Such an unusual placement. No records before age 5, no family history we could trace. But the moment I saw her, she paused, staring into her tea as if it held answers. She looked at me with these ancient eyes, as if she'd been waiting centuries for someone to find her. Margaret's throat constricted. Every word Professor Chen spoke painted a picture of the impossible child now hiding in Ravenshallow's cellar, trusting Margaret with secrets that predated living memory. Children can be remarkably perceptive, she managed. This goes beyond perception. Professor Chen set down her cup with trembling fingers. Evangeline knows things, Mrs. Thornfield. She can tell you the history of buildings she's never seen, recite family genealogies from memory, describe events that happened before she was born with perfect accuracy. My colleagues think she's gifted, a prodigy with an eidetic memory. But I've seen her sleepwalk through my house, speaking in languages that died out centuries ago. Constable Wickham shifted uncomfortably. Professor, perhaps we should focus on recent events. No. The word cracked like a whip. Professor Chen's composure finally shattered completely, and she buried her face in her hands. You don't understand. None of you understand what she is, what she's capable of. 2 nights ago, I found her standing in my garden at midnight, staring at the stars and crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said she could feel something calling to her, something old and lonely and waiting. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Her own midnight vigils before Evangeline's portrait suddenly took on terrifying new significance. Had the child somehow sensed those whispered conversations across time and distance? She said she had to go home, Professor Chen continued, her voice breaking entirely. But Cambridge is the only home she's ever known. I thought it was a nightmare, childhood confusion. I made her warm milk and sang her back to sleep, and when morning came, she seemed perfectly normal. But that evening, when I came home from the university, she gestured helplessly, gone. Her bed slept in, her favorite books missing, but no sign of how she left or where she went. The constable cleared his throat. Which brings us here, Mrs. Thornfield. The bus driver remembers a child matching Evangeline's description buying a ticket to Lower Brambleworth yesterday morning. She would have been dropped at the crossroads, less than 2 miles from your gates. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities and dangers. The village crossroads commanded a clear view of anyone approaching Ravenshallow's main drive, if Evangeline had been seen. I walked those roads yesterday afternoon, she said carefully. The storm was building, but I needed to check our boundary markers before the weather turned. I saw no one. It was a necessary lie, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. Professor Chen was studying her with those intelligent eyes, and Margaret had the unsettling sensation of being dissected by someone who spent her professional life uncovering buried truths. May I ask, Professor Chen said slowly, how long you've worked here? 40 years this December. The truth, at least, came easier. And in all that time, you've never encountered anything unusual? Unexplained sounds, perhaps, or glimpses of movement where none should be? The question hung in the air like a trap. Margaret felt sweat beading between her shoulder blades despite the morning chill. This woman knew something. Perhaps not the specific truth about Evangeline, but enough to sense the currents of mystery that flowed through Ravenshallow like underground streams. Old houses have their own sounds, Margaret replied evenly. Settling timbers, mice in the walls, wind through broken shutters. After 40 years, you learn to ignore them. But Professor Chen was no longer listening. She had risen and moved to the portrait gallery, drawn by some invisible force to stand before the painted image of Evangeline Ravenshallow. Margaret watched in frozen horror as the professor reached out with one trembling finger to trace the gilded nameplate beneath the frame. Evangeline, she whispered. Born 1879, died 1887. The silence that followed felt alive, crackling with unspoken recognition. Professor Chen turned slowly, her face pale as winter moonlight, her eyes wide with dawning understanding. Mrs. Thornfield, she said, her voice steady despite the impossibility of what she was about to ask. That portrait. Who painted it? Margaret felt the last foundations of her ordinary world crumble beneath her feet. The ordeal had truly begun. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words emerged. The question hung between them like a blade poised to fall, and she could feel Professor Chen's brilliant mind assembling pieces of an impossible puzzle. Behind the academic's shocked expression, Margaret glimpsed something far more dangerous than suspicion: recognition. The family records would indicate, Margaret began, but her voice cracked like splintering wood. 40 years of carefully maintained normalcy had not prepared her for this moment, when truth and lies became indistinguishable and every word carried the weight of catastrophe. Professor Chen stepped closer to the portrait, her scholarly instincts overriding her maternal anguish. The brushwork suggests late 19th century, probably commissioned work. But the subject— Her voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to echo through the suddenly oppressive gallery. Mrs. Thornfield, this child in the painting, she looks exactly like my Evangeline. Not similar, identical. Constable Wickham moved between them, his practical mind rejecting what his eyes insisted was true. Coincidence, surely. Children often share similar features, especially with that pale coloring. Professor Chen's scholarly authority silenced him. Look at the bone structure, the specific shade of the eyes, the exact curve of the mouth. This isn't coincidence. She turned to Margaret with dawning horror. You've seen her, haven't you? My Evangeline, she's been here. The accusation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at her to deny, to deflect, to maintain the comfortable fiction that had protected Ravenshallow's secrets for a century. But Professor Chen's eyes held such desperate hope, such crushing need, that Margaret felt her carefully. Constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Professor Chen, she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, I think perhaps you should sit down. She's here. The words erupted from Professor Chen with terrible certainty. She's in this house. That's why the portrait drew her, why she spoke of coming home. She spun toward the constable. We need to search every room, every closet, every— Sarah. The voice that cut through Professor Chen's rising hysteria came from the shadows at the top of the grand staircase. Margaret's heart stopped as a pale figure descended with that same impossible grace, moving like water over stone. Evangeline wore one of Margaret's spare uniforms, hastily altered but still hanging loose on her small frame. In the morning light filtering through tall windows, she looked both achingly real and utterly ethereal. Professor Chen's teacup shattered on the marble floor. Hello, Mum, Evangeline said softly, and Margaret watched the last of her ordered world collapse into chaos. The reunion that followed was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. Professor Chen dropped to her knees, gathering Evangeline into her arms with desperate relief, while the child submitted to the embrace with patient affection that seemed older than stone. Over Professor Chen's head, Evangeline's ancient eyes met Margaret's with profound sadness. How? Professor Chen whispered, pulling back to study her daughter's face. How did you get here? Why did you run away? I didn't run away from you, Evangeline said gently. I came home. Constable Wickham cleared his throat, his official duty warring with the strangeness of what he was witnessing. Mrs. Thornfield, you said you hadn't seen any child. Yet here she is, wearing what appears to be estate clothing. I found her this morning, Margaret interrupted, the lie feeling like poison on her tongue, sheltering in one of the outbuildings. She was frightened, disoriented. I was trying to calm her before calling for help. But even as she spoke, Margaret knew it was hopeless. Professor Chen was too intelligent, had studied too many mysteries to accept such a transparent deception. The academic's eyes moved from Evangeline to the portrait to Margaret, with growing comprehension of impossible truths. The dates, Professor Chen said suddenly. Evangeline Ravenshallow died in 1887. But you— She looked at the child in her arms with dawning horror and wonder. You told me once that you remembered a fire, that you could smell smoke in your dreams. Evangeline's small hand touched her adoptive mother's cheek. I'm sorry, Mum. I tried to be normal for you, but when the calling became too strong— What calling? Constable Wickham demanded, his practical mind rejecting what his ears insisted he was hearing. Margaret watched helplessly as her carefully guarded secret spilled into the morning light, like blood from a mortal wound. Professor Chen was brilliant, educated, steeped in historical research. She would not dismiss this as childhood fantasy or convenient coincidence. And Constable Wickham, for all his rural simplicity, was still an officer of the law faced with a missing child and increasingly bizarre circumstances. "We should go," Professor Chen said suddenly, rising with Evangeline in her arms. "Come home with me, darling. We'll sort this out properly." But Evangeline shook her head, her pale features resolute. "I can't leave again, Mum. This is where I belong." Margaret felt something precious and fragile dying inside her chest. The brief, beautiful dream of protecting this impossible child was crumbling into catastrophe, taking with it any chance of the quiet, purposeful existence she had imagined. She had lost everything that mattered before she had even understood what she was fighting to preserve.